All right, well, welcome everyone to a Teaching Tips live session. Today we have Rebecca Disrud and Ruth Vanderpool to talk about student engagement with peer review. I think they have some interesting ideas and research-backed work for you. So I will leave it to you all to introduce yourself, and I will be moderating. I'm Chris Lott with the University of Washington-Tacoma Office of Digital Learning. And with that, Rebecca and Ruth, it's all yours.
Thanks, Chris. Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Rebecca Disrud, the director of the Writing Center, and I'm so happy that Ruth is with me. I'll let her introduce herself.
Hi, my name is Ruth Vanderpool, and I teach math at UW-T. Thank you for inviting me.
All right, I'm going to share my screen just a second. All right. Just move some boxes. So we are indeed talking about engaging students and also boosting learning with peer review. This is the overview of what we're going to talk about today. I am first going to just give you an overview of some of the research on peer review that I actually found somewhat counterintuitive when I was reviewing it myself. So we're going to talk about if peer review improves writing, and spoiler alert, yes, it does, but possibly not for the reasons that you may think. I am going to describe the difference between orienting your peer review activity toward the instructor or toward the writer. So we call this instructor focused peer review or writer focused peer review. And then I will show you some of those counterintuitive research findings about what is actually effective in peer review for students. I will look at whether peer review is helpful for mechanics, by which I mean some of those sentence level issues. Punctuation often gets termed as grammar or syntax. Are students able to comment on those features effectively? And then what does good feedback look like? Often we are doing peer review because we want students to give and receive good feedback, but what are the actual features of that feedback? I will show you what the research says, and then we will talk about modeling, which I think is an extremely important aspect of peer review and one of the main ways that you can engage students and boost their learning. And then I'm so happy that Ruth is going to talk about how she uses peer review in her classes, and I will also give you some examples from one of my classes in writing studies. And then I'm just briefly going to talk about using Canvas to facilitate peer review. And we have some resources, instructor-focused resources on our TLC website that I want to point out at the end as well. Okay, so I'm just going to spend a few minutes, as I said, overviewing the research. So does peer review improve writing? It does, but possibly not for the reasons that you may think. The things that students benefit from in peer review are actually applying the assignment or the rubric criteria to a new context, which is to say someone else's writing. And in that process, they can gain a clearer understanding of the expectations of the assignment or the audience, which is often the instructor. Ideally, the audience is a little bit bigger than just the instructor, but often, that is a main component of the audience. And also, they can gain a clearer sense of how a reader experiences a text. So when students are writing, or when anyone's writing, it can be difficult at first to remove yourself from your position as a writer and put yourself in the position of someone viewing this text as an outsider. And this is one of the things students often say when they come to the writing centers. They just want someone, an outside reader or another eye to look it over. And so in the process of doing peer review, they actually sort of put themselves in that place. And in doing that process of understanding the expectations more clearly and getting a clearer sense of how the reader experiences a text, they can then apply that more effectively to their own writing. And that's actually one of the biggest benefits of peer review. Another really huge benefit is reading and writing with someone else. Which in this context we might call learner-learner engagement or peer-to-peer engagement. And so that has been shown by the research to be hugely effective in boosting learning as well. The actual feedback that students receive in peer review can be variable. I'm sure we've all experienced that. I'm going to talk about how we can hopefully also improve the quality of the feedback that they are receiving. Sarah, did you have a question?
Yes, I do. But again, I'm happy to, like, if you hear this question, you're like, let's talk about this later. I totally feel fine about that. But there's one of the reasons that I have been using peer review this quarter is because I think some of my students need help, like imagining how to respond to the text. And so, or to the prompts that I give them for the assignment. And so I've asked them to do peer review because I think that it has helped them to like brainstorm ways to like apply course concepts. And I'm wondering if you know anything about, like, is there research about that is something that happens, or would you link that into these benefits you're listing? Or is this, am I just like hoping that happens, but actually it's probably not?
No, I think that is perfectly reasonable. I am going to talk about some things that I think are pretty closely related to that. And then we could follow up with that maybe later in the presentation. Ruth is also going to talk about how she uses outside texts for peer review. So hopefully that will give us like a place to start talking. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is the focus of the activity of peer review. And so how are you as an instructor orienting the focus? And I have developed these two categories. I call it instructor focused peer review versus writer focused peer review. And I think instructor focused is the mode that I most commonly see. I think it is commonly assigned. When I was a student, this was the mode that I usually operated under in peer review. So in this mode of peer review, the activity is designed to perfect the writing for the instructor's eyes. I've heard a lot of instructors say, well, I want to do peer review so that the students sort of clean up each other's writing before it gets to me. And that is very understandable and very relatable. So I can definitely relate to that desire. If you are doing that, I think that you are not capitalizing necessarily on the actual benefits of peer review. So if this instructor focused peer review, where students are potentially doing this pretty late in the process, it's probably more editing oriented. Again, they're sort of cleaning up, so to speak, the writing before you grade it. This is again focused on improving the writing before it gets to you, the instructor. And it may depend on knowledge that students do not have. So I'm going to show you some research in just a minute about how effectively students can actually edit at the sentence level. But generally speaking, we are not instructing students in this in most of our classes. And so this is sort of asking them to draw on knowledge that isn't part of our learning objectives in the class and that we're probably not providing a lot of instruction on. On the other hand, if we are doing writer-focused peer review, this is an activity that is designed to boost learning of the assignment. So it is ideally conducted like midway through the drafting process when students are still developing their ideas and can still revise them substantively. It's hopefully conversation oriented or revision oriented. We're hopefully focusing more at that, what I would call the higher order concerns or the global level, their use of evidence, their construction of argument, that kind of thing, critical thinking objectives. And it is focused on building knowledge. So building understanding of what an argument looks like in this context, or building understanding of some other feature of your assignment, rather than asking them to draw on pre-existing knowledge that they may not have. Utah, I see you have your hand up.
Hi, everybody. It's Utah. Science and math, biology. I was wondering, Rebecca, if you consider this completely makes sense to me, these two categories. I was wondering if you considered them never the twain shall meet, because I feel separate. I feel that I have 2 rounds of peer review set up in my class, early draft, middle draft, and then the third draft comes to me. So I'm definitely doing the instructor focused one because I definitely want the writing to be good by the time, and the paper to be fairly complete by the time it comes to me. But I also want the students, especially in the, as you said, in the early draft, to read it through, just all the points that you've already made about the writer focused aspect. So do you, that's kind of my approach. So what feedback, what do you think? Comments, thoughts?
I think that is great. That sounds effective. I would not say these are necessarily mutually exclusive. I think that, for instructors who maybe inherited a paradigm, as I did before I started looking into this, if this was the paradigm you inherited, I think it's worth thinking about, like, what are your actual goals for this assignment? Is it to clean up the writing before it gets to me? Or is it to boost learning? And so what are your goals and how are you designing that activity? I think that is the thing that is worth thinking about as you're designing the activity. I am going to talk about sentence level editing in a minute. And so, I think what you have described sounds like it could be valuable. Thanks for that question. Okay, so a few counterintuitive findings on peer review. The research shows students might benefit more from giving feedback than from getting it. And I think as I have looked into the research and had a lot of experience in the Writing Center with students giving and receiving feedback, this is not surprising to me. But when I first thought about it, it was kind of revolutionary. So if you think about the actual benefit that students might be getting is in providing the feedback, that might really change how you are designing and orienting this activity. Student feedback on mechanics is variable. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. It's not that they can't do this. They will do it better if you provide instruction, particularly around disciplinary conventions. However, what students can learn to do very effectively and relatively quickly is to provide feedback on higher order concerns. Particularly in what the literature calls a problem suggestion format. And I will show you some examples of that in a second. And then finally, students will be more engaged and learn more if you model the process for them, which is a way of practicing with them. And that is not surprising. We often do better when we practice things. Okay, so is peer review helpful for mechanics? By which I mean grammar, syntax, punctuation, those kinds of things. Maybe. So I read with great interest this study by Chris Anson, who's a major figure in writing studies. He and his team conducted a study in 2017. And what they did was they collected a large body of student papers, like maybe 100 papers, I don't remember exactly. And he and his team went through these papers and coded every single, what we would call errors in mechanics in these papers. So some of those more annoying errors that bother us, like sentence boundary issues, where you have sentence fragments, incomplete sentences, or run-on sentences where you have really long sentences that should be divided up, subject-verb agreement issues, those kinds of things. And then also some more minor errors that I myself might be hard-pressed to identify, sort of like substituting a that for a which, or some very minor punctuation things. So all of those errors. And so he and his team read these papers, identified all of those as professionals, and then they gave these papers out to students to peer review. And what they found was that these students could identify about 1 in 10 possible errors during peer review, so not a very high percentage. And then also about 1 in 4 of the errors that they did identify were not actually errors. And I think maybe we've seen examples of this before, where students fix things for each other and they either do it incorrectly or they fix things that don't need to be fixed that are actually fine the way they are. And so this research suggests to me that students have kind of a variable capacity to do this effectively. I would say if you are very interested in having students do peer review in this way, you can increase your success by identifying a set of features to comment on. For instance, sentence boundary issues, maybe some disciplinary issues from your field. Like APA has a lot of ways that it likes research to be introduced, and provide some instruction about those, and then have students look for those issues specifically in their papers. If you are interested in this, I'd be very happy to talk to you more about this. But the rest of my presentation focuses more on more of the global critical thinking issues. Okay, so what does good feedback actually look like? According to the research, it is focused on higher order concerns, which might include idea development, cohesion, clarity, use of evidence, explanation of evidence, and then your rubric criteria. So what criteria have you identified as priorities? And the feedback that students give each other would focus on those features of the writing. And then a couple of studies have shown that this problem suggestion format is very effective for students in learning how to give feedback and also increasing the quality of feedback that students give and therefore the quality of feedback that students receive. Students can be coached to present in a positive tone. Generally speaking, more positive than negative is usually more effective. And it should be limited to 2 to 3 major points. And so when you are designing a peer review activity, these are all things that you can build into the activity, that you're just going to focus on 2 to 3 features. We're going to practice being a little bit positive. We're going to practice this problem suggestion format. Okay, so what does this look like? I put a couple of examples here on this slide, and the problem that they have identified is in red, and then the suggestion that they are suggesting is in green. So here's one example. The rubric asks us to base our recommendation on 3 sources of evidence, but I couldn't identify any sources of evidence. Sorry, I didn't use this in your argument reasoning. Later in the paper, you talk about X report and the article by Y. I think you could incorporate that evidence earlier, maybe by saying, etc. And so what I think is useful about this is it is not just pointing out a problem, it is suggesting a way for the writer to improve. And so that feedback is actionable by the writer, whether or not they agree. They might have a different suggestion or solution, which is fine. But also for the student giving that feedback, they are learning something about that feature or that criterion in your assignment or in your rubric. This rubric asks us to base our recommendation on 3 sources of evidence. So it's causing them to think more about what that means and what that might look like. Here's another one. My understanding of the findings section is that it should only include the results. Your analysis of the results should go in the discussion section. I've marked some places in your findings that I think you could move to the results section. So again, this is focusing on an organizational issue and suggesting a way that the student could improve their organization and fulfill the criteria more effectively. Okay, so how can you boost learning? You can remember that students get the most value and engagement from giving feedback. Again, that is a little bit counterintuitive. In your assignment, you can create a worksheet, again, that focuses on 2 or 3 higher order concerns, or you can use the rubric that you use when you evaluate student writing. That's what I do with the problem suggestion format. You can model the process actively in class before the review, which Ruth is going to talk about in a minute. And then if possible, if you can allow time for peer conversation or reflection after the peer review, that is also shown to be very effective. Okay, so what is modeling? This is where you practice reviewing together. So you can choose 1 or 2 criteria from the assignment and review the language together. So we're all on the same page about what this means. You provide 1 or 2 excerpts of student writing to peer review, or it doesn't have to be student writing. You can make up your own example. You can use professional examples, whatever you want to use. And then with the students, you use the problem suggestion format to analyze the writing. So has this writer fulfilled this feature effectively? And what would you suggest? And then you can practice the kinds of comments that would be helpful. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Ruth Vanderpool to talk about what she does in her classes.
Great, thank you. All right, so I'm Ruth Vanderpool. I teach math. And so what I wanted to do is I wanted to kind of walk you through a little bit of what we do in TMath 350, which is a junior seminar, but I wanted to give you a little bit of context before I jump into the peer editing thing. Mostly 2 things. One is that the rubrics. So all the math classes, we all use the same rubric across our entire curriculum. And so you can see the colors behind, kind of the most faded rubric is actually behind on this slide. That's the rubric that we use across our entire math curriculum. And then the kind of simplified version in Canvas up in the forefront. But we tend to use the same curriculum across the board because of all of these perks. Like mostly this means that when students show up in my TMath 350 class, there's a very good chance that a lot of students have some pre-existing familiarity with the expectations. So I'm not starting from ground zero. And then because this is the same rubric they'll see in other classes, I can call that out and call out that they're going to see it and build, and we're going to keep building their understanding of this rubric all the way through their curriculum here. So that's one piece of context. The second piece of context is the next slide, and that actually goes to this thing that Sarah mentioned in kind of way back in the beginning about how like there's other things that I'm trying to get the students to get from peer reviewing besides making something look pretty. I have a lot of student learning objectives that I'm trying to hit that are completely independent of writing style. Or even genre specific. And so I'm having students like engage with each other to help brainstorming, like Sarah mentioned. And so here's just a bunch of the student learning objectives that I just came off the top of my head that are actually incorporated in all of these assignments. Like we're trying to teach them how to read math journals in a sophisticated way, see and describe math that's not in the UW curriculum, use databases. So there's a lot of library researches. Learn a markup language. There's programming that our students are learning. They need to build and find collaborators for a capstone project for their major, and they need to outline their entire kind of rest of the curriculum while they're here at UW before they graduate. So there's a lot of student learning objectives that we're hitting with these assignments that are completely independent of is the sentence pretty or not. But they're also really important and going to be served well by peer evaluations. All right, okay, so here's a quick summary kind of a lot of the peer evaluations that showed up. I kind of purpled the things where you could see things, peer evaluation and modeling that we were talking about. Week 1, we introduced some technical writing. Week 2, like that's where the modeling, the first thing that I do after we talk about it in abstract is we actually start modeling it before I even ask them to do anything on their own. Week 3 is an article summary where they're actually going to get some peer evaluation of sorts. And then week 5 and week 6, there's more of these peer evaluations. So it's all the way throughout the course. And each of these is actually either the same assignment or new assignment. So it's like sometimes we do the UTA method where it's the same assignment that we're hitting twice, and sometimes we're just hitting the assignment once. All right, go ahead and go to the next slide. I'm just going to walk through about 3 of them. So in week 2, that's where, so I'd say it's week 2, but a lot of times we'd say it's week 1. This is usually the autumn, so it starts midway through the week. But this is where the modeling comes in. So I've assigned readings for technical writing, but now we're actually going to practice it a little bit. So in class, I provide an article, and a lot of the way that I tackle these student learning objectives is we're giving them articles of mathematics topics, and we're asking the students to summarize the articles. So it's pretty, on Bloom's taxonomy thing, it's kind of lower level. We're not synthesizing, we're summarizing, right? We're not connecting to everything else, we're just summarizing. But that hits a lot of the student learning objectives that we want to do. So we provide an article that's pretty quick to read, and then I give an example summary, which is what's here in the foreground, A Teacher's Disciplinary Knowledge by Ruth Vanderpool. I give them 15 minutes in class to read both the article and my summary. So the article's only 1 page, and so the summary is pretty easy to write a summary of a 1 page. Like, to be fair, I gave myself an easy assignment. But I give them 15 minutes to do all the reading, and there's also the rubric. I hand them the rubric, and so they fill out the rubric individually. And then we take probably about 20 minutes. It probably takes us longer to actually discuss as a class that rubric, but we don't talk about the whole rubric. We only talk about 2 categories. Yeah, Sarah, I think I see your hand.
Just to make sure I'm tracking, when you say you give them a rubric, is this a rubric for their assignment, or is it a rubric they use to analyze the article?
It's the same rubric that we use for all of our writing assignments across all of the math curriculum. So there's a few slides back, you can actually see the categories. Thank you,
Okay, I'm
Rebecca.
remembering
Yeah.
that rubric. So you're tight. So
Yeah.
that's the rubric you're giving. Okay,
That's
got
the
it.
rubric we're using. Yeah, the problem and
Second.
process, content clarity, writing clarity, and completeness. And so you'll notice that there's a lack of detailedness with this rubric because we're using it across the entire curriculum. It means that the rubric is not assignment specific. So nowhere in my rubric does it talk about summary, right? So that summarizing is actually captured by the completeness criteria. And so we actually talk about that. So the two criteria that we usually do when I'm first modeling this is the completeness and the content clarity. The content clarity is usually the thing that the mathematicians really need to work on because technical writing is hard. And so that content clarity is really what we focus on a lot. And then the completeness is where we get to start talking about summaries. But that's a really good point, is that like by using the same rubric across the curriculum, it means that I lose some detail when I'm talking about the rubrics. Excellent. I should say that this summary is bad. So when we fill out this rubric, initially, so there's a tendency that I find where a lot of my students are very supportive and very kind to each other, which I really appreciate. But a lot of my students will read this and they'll be like, oh, this is advanced. This content clarity is very advanced. And then we talk about it and they like start scaling it back. On my rubric, I actually like pulled it up the last time we talked about it, and everything is actually in the basic category. So this is an example, like this is not a good example. This is actually me modeling a bad summary. And so a lot of students will be like, well, do you have a good summary? I'm like, yeah, I got a good summary too. But identifying errors and then modeling how to make those suggestions, I think captures what Rebecca was talking about a little bit more, where we could be like, oh, this the rubric is talking about how maybe there's too many explicit computations here that maybe aren't needed. And it looks like right here we might be doing that. Maybe we could clean those up and skip some of those steps. So we can start modeling that language for them. And we usually come up to a consensus in kind of content clarity and completeness in about 20 minutes. So that's the kind of like the first example of a summary that they see and me trying to model that. Does that make sense to folks? Any questions about that? All right, okay, so. All right, so the next week is where the students start actually like providing their own summaries, right? So instead of looking at somebody else's summary, this is when they're going to start actually trying to write. And they have an example that's not so great, and they have an example that's pretty good. So this is an assignment one called LaTeX assignment because of other student learning objectives. But in this is the first time that they're going to write the rubric, and I also ask them to include a self-evaluation of their rubric. And so I used to do this, and students would be like, advanced, everything's great, or everything's awful. And so what I did is I modified the grading so that the evaluation of the assignment is actually now dependent on the difference between their self-evaluation and my evaluation. And in doing this, it really like forces the students to get in the headspace of me, right? As opposed to I am a student. It's a what is my instructor looking for? Because my grade actually depends on what my instructor is looking for. So I let the evaluation is a function of the difference between my score and their score. The closer it is, the higher it pulls up their average, and then kind of my overall score. That way they don't just turn in something awful and then circle awful and then get full marks. But it really kind of forces the headspace into being like, what is my teacher thinking about? It kind of forces them into a different point of view. All right, the next week 4, is when I finally have them do an article, and it's like much more standard. Like, now turn in your article, normal grading. And so they do exchange it. Yeah, like it's like they've had kind of, we're in week 4 is the first time they actually turn something in, like without this kind of peer editing. All right, okay, so that's week 4. We're halfway through the quarter. I think I only have one more slide. The remaining week, there's again peer evaluations, but now we kind of start jumping into more Utah style evaluation, where I've kind of got a tiered system that's happening. And this is also where they're working towards other student learning objectives, where they're trying to build their capstone project and group. And so I start having them work in groups, and this is up until now, the students actually haven't been talking with each other about their summaries. It's always been a conversation kind of like as a group or with me, or forcing them to think in my headspace. It's not until the second half of the quarter where the students are actually doing the more traditional exchanging summaries with each other and actually giving each other feedback. But they're doing it not alone, they're doing it as a group. So I'm forcing a group dynamic. So groups switch summaries with other groups. And in that way, they have extra support, so that hopefully we have less false positives and less false negatives when they're supporting each other's with their grammar mistakes. Is that they can actually have a conversation about it, and they're all invested in it. And I also we also model that that language, and we remind people about how they need to make concrete suggestions about how to improve things to work themselves up on that rubric. And then there's some extra like evaluations that are again kind of dependent on my evaluation versus theirs, and how that difference is, to really remind them that they need to keep in mind the evaluation. The instructor is really making sure that they keep the evaluator in mind when they're doing all their edits. All right, so I think that's a brief outline of what we do in 350, so that you kind of have that example in your back pocket. I can hand that over to Rebecca if there's no questions.
Thank you, Ruth. I'm sure there will be questions at the end. I really love to hear like how much instruction and practice you do with the students. I think that's really great. I'm just going to give you a brief overview of what I do in my class that is T-Write 311. And this is a writing studies class. To give you some context, the class is basically designed around a central question, which is an open question in our field. It's actually 2 questions, like, should we continue to teach standard English, and should we correct grammatical errors? And I think both of those questions have sort of common sense answers until you look into the research and actually find it quite varied. And so one of the things that we do is look at the very conflicting research around those questions. And then students have to eventually come to a consensus in groups and write a recommendation for a public audience. In the past, we've done an explainer thread or a Twitter thread. I think I'm going to be moving into an explainer essay in future versions of this class. But they are writing like both for our class community and then potentially for a public audience as well. And so I just want to show that the way I have designed the class is every single reading and every activity is feeding into that central inquiry question, and also helping them build knowledge to write this assignment. So in week 1, we introduce our core questions, and then we start our weekly reading discussion boards where they're reading and beginning to analyze and process their readings in writing. And then in week 3, we analyze examples together. So a lot of students in this class have never written an explainer thread before. It's a new genre for them. And I imagine the same would be true for an explainer essay. But if you look at some examples of what's out there, it actually has very recognizable features that we can identify together by looking through examples. And then we collect those features and then build a rubric together about what features we would like to see in our own writing based on like what would be expected to see in these examples. And that is actually a lot of fun and doesn't really take that long. And so as we build that rubric, students are again developing knowledge about what this assignment could look like and what they might expect to see as audience members. And so then in week 6, their first drafts are due, and I provide a lot of feedback using that rubric that we developed. So another thing that I really like about that rubric is that my priorities in the assignment are very clear to me. And so then they're hopefully very clear to students too. So I'll show you what that looks like in a second. But as I am providing feedback, it's very clear to me what my priorities are and what order I would sort of comment on. So the first one is that they have to have a recommendation. So they have to answer the question with a recommendation. If they haven't done that, then that would be my first priority. Then there's features around evidence use and genre features and that kind of thing. So then by the time we get to peer review in week 7, they are hopefully very familiar with what this assignment could look like or does look like in terms of what other people have written. They have received feedback on what they've done so far and how they might move that forward. And they have a very clear sense of the rubric that I will be using to evaluate them. And so they use that same rubric to peer review each other. So by then, hopefully, like the priorities and the process is very clear to them. And so then by week 10, their final drafts are due. I don't really provide much feedback at that point because we have invested providing our feedback earlier in the process when they can still incorporate it and revise substantially. So this is what my rubric looks like. I use just a 1-column rubric. So we have the criteria, like they should have genre features. So again, if we're doing an explainer essay, it should look like that. It should have 280 characters per tweet. It should have 10 to 20 tweets. Obviously, those would be different for an essay, but there would be features for that too. Then it should have a recommendation. So it should state a definitive recommendation in response to our question and do something to contextualize why this is a complex question. And it should be sequenced in a certain way. It should have use of evidence that we've talked about. And so then in the comments, I will just comment on, how effectively they have fulfilled these criteria and what my priority is for them in their revision. And so they use the same rubric when they comment on each other's. So, they could say in the problem suggestion format, our assignment is meant to have a definitive recommendation. I'm not getting as a reader a clear sense of what your recommendation is, which is very common in a first draft because these questions are very difficult. So then they can say like, later in the thread, you state this. I'm wondering if this would be the basis for a more definitive recommendation, that kind of suggestion for revision. Okay, I just have a couple of things to say about facilitating peer review online, and I would love to hear if you all have experience with that, if you have further suggestions about how to use Canvas or other online platforms to do this. As I have used Canvas, the thing that I have found that works the best is to use discussion boards. So I've had it's been kind of tricky to have students be able to access each other's drafts. Emailing things back and forth, me having to share them. If they post them on discussion boards, everyone can access that. So I found that works really well. And then the other thing I like about that is that I can provide very specific instructions at the top. If we're using a worksheet or a rubric, I can attach that. I can write in some instructions and some examples right in that discussion board too, hopefully as a reminder or reinforcement of what we have already discussed in class. But if you're teaching asynchronously, you can, put that information at the top of the discussion board. And then students can thread their peer review comments, and sometimes some discussion will develop back and forth, which is really nice. I just want to point you to one resource on our website. We have a pretty extensive handout for instructors about facilitating peer review, some example worksheets that you can adapt for your own classes. And we are also very happy to either lead a peer review session in your class or collaborate with you on developing one of those. And these are my sources, but I'm going to stop sharing now and see if there's discussion or questions. And I see Chris has his hand up. Wonderful. Chris, you're on mute.
I have some questions for later, perhaps if there's time, but I just wanted to note that we will provide, along with this video, links to everything that you're seeing, as well as other material and resources, and I'll talk about a few of those at the very end. So you don't have to scan and try to get the things off the slides here. We'll share all of that. So it looks like Ruben has to go. Thanks for coming, Ruben. Oh, Sarah has a question.
I do, but I just want to note that this is like my third question. So if you want to let other people go in front of me, I totally respect that. I always have like hundreds of questions. So so by priority, I think these are sort of like two key questions that I'm grappling with in the way that I've been doing peer review this quarter. And the first is, if each of you could speak at least a little briefly to like, how do you grade the peer review? Like, do you have a rubric you use for grading how the students used the rubric on the assignment, right? So that's something I've been kind of struggling with thinking through. And similar with that, I've done all of my peer reviews online, so this question could be unique to that modality. But what do you do when students like don't show up? So like I like make groups and partners for the peer review, and then some students like don't participate, and so it sort of leaves their partner hanging in this like awkward way that I can't give them credit for doing it because their partner didn't show up, but it's not their fault. And that has just created like a lot of labor for me of like checking it and making a backup plan. And so I'm wondering if either you have experience with that or ideas for resources for me related to that.
Ruth, do you want to talk about that? I know you've had a lot of experience with that before.
So with regards to the how to mark and evaluate and assess peer evaluation, I do it a few different ways. In the 350 class I was telling you, that's very numerical actually, and it doesn't capture like the suggestions of how to positively make suggestions. But I do a numerical way in some classes where I'm like, okay, well, how did you evaluate your peer? Okay, how did I evaluate that peer? And then their marks are actually a function of that difference. So the farther off they are, the lower their grade is. That's a very numerical answer. But in other classes, so for example, in my abstract algebra class and in my linear algebra class, I actually we do this again where I give them a proof and I ask them to peer edit it. And I just actually list what they need to do in order to get the point. So they have to identify the logical errors, and it's like I make sure there's 2 of them in there. And then they have to provide concrete suggestions for how to improve the writing and the organization of the proof. And so it's like they might find other things, but it's on all of their quizzes and exams. Like they actually practice this every time. So it's very numerical, actually. I'm like, well, did you make a concrete suggestion? You didn't, so you don't get that point. So that's kind of the first assessment question. Rebecca, did you want to deal with the assessment question before we think about the absence issue?
Sure, I do something very similar. So I have often taught my class hybrid recently. And so on the days that are asynchronous, they have some kind of discussion board activity usually, and those are all worth usually 5 points. And so peer review is one of those. And so they get 5 points for doing it. Since they can basically peer review anyone's in the class, yeah, they if they don't do it, it doesn't really mess up my system that way because I can just match them with someone else very quickly. But it's worth 5 points, and I don't really. I've looked at the feedback that they give. I don't grade them very intensely on that. I haven't had a problem really with surface level feedback with them like trying to skate by, because by this point in the class, they're pretty invested in the assignment and they have a pretty clear understanding of it. So I found that helps a lot. So yeah, go ahead, Ruth.
Yeah, so for the absence, if somebody is missing like actual peer evaluation in class, I usually just move it outside of class. So nothing's ever due in class. I usually like start the activity and then they can continue it outside of class. So if somebody's not there, I can usually just match them up and then leave the ball in their court for making sure that they can contact with each other. So I don't know, maybe that's like lazy or cheating, but I just outsource it. I'm like, okay, well, you weren't here to get it started, but you're still responsible for doing that outside of class. It's still due in 2 days. So I still collect it. That makes sense.
I had another thought about the absence question, which is thinking back to what the research says that students benefit more from giving feedback than getting it. It doesn't really matter if they're giving feedback on someone's paper from that class at that moment. Like you could have kind of a group of papers that if someone doesn't show up, you can say, that's okay. Why don't you just do this one instead? And they're still getting the benefits of giving that feedback. If the getting of the feedback and incorporating it is important to your assignment, then that's a little bit different, but they can still participate in peer review, even if their partner doesn't show up.
Yeah, thank you for that. I've sort of, one thing I've done is ask them to apply it like to themselves, like to do the self-eval, which is sort of that, but I like that example of having some samples for them. So yeah, thank you.
Yuta?
Hi, everybody. Just, I guess, a comment from my end. I have used the peer evaluation setup in Canvas, and it seems to do fine. So I was interested to hear that, Rebecca, you use the discussion board to manage all that. I just, click on an assignment. I set it to do, to assign the peer assignments at a certain time point after the due day, the due time. And then I create a second assignment where I give the instructions for the peer review, and that's where the students will get credit for doing it. And I'm lazy; they just get credit for doing it. But I like Ruth's idea of, how well did you do it? So I might build that in the Ruth method. So I'm just, to me, Canvas, the system within Canvas to me has worked pretty well. Granted, it is a little more work because you have to go in and you have to go look at the peer reviews. Did the students do it? Check, then go to the other assignment, do the speed grader there and put it in. So it's a little bit clunky, but it's not awful.
Great, thanks for that.
Can I add something real quick here on that topic? Just this won't help future viewers because it won't matter, but for people now, there is a pilot going on through spring of a terribly named thing, Feedback Fruits, which has a peer review and a group member review thing. But the peer review is being piloted, and it does have some sophisticated features to help manage some of the things around absences. It also deals with the fact that Canvas doesn't allow for multi-part kind of grading and things. So I think you might want to look into that pilot. It's going through the spring. I will send everybody who registered or attended a link to look in if you want to take part and try it out. I have poked around with it, but I don't have a class I'm teaching right now to try it on. So I'll send that link around. If anybody here has tried it, please feel free to chime in.
Well, let me Libby, did you want to say anything? I know I'm sort of wanting to ask a follow-up question, but I don't want to cut you off if you were saying something.
Oh no, you're fine. I'm good. Just listening and gathering intel.
Awesome. Okay. Okay. Well, maybe, so I think there's some things I didn't understand about at least what Yuta, am I saying your name right? What you were saying? Okay. So let me tell you my process and you can explain to me what you're doing that's different. But so I make a discussion board and I call it like peer review for scrapbook entry 3. And then I break students into groups. And then I say like who reviews who, like student A review B, review C, review D, review A, or whatever, something like that. And then I get like really pushy in class and remind them like, okay, you need to submit your assignment on Wednesday, but then the feedback is due on Sunday. And so like people are always confused about that. And I've like been trying to figure out how to like, so anyway, I'm new to Canvas this year, but so I just like discovered the like ungraded, like a non-graded assignment. So then I can add that. So like That's an assignment for them to submit their entry on Wednesday, but then they have to go back and like do feedback on their peers. And so in the discussion board, I have like very detailed, like here's 5 questions. You need to respond specifically to each question. Did the student include a course connection? What is the course connection? Whatever, stuff like that. And so then what I find is like students are forgetting to submit it. And then always like a quarter of the class almost just like peace out and just like don't do it. And then students are confused about like, what am I supposed to do? No one submitted. And so then I have to like go back in and figure out what to do. So you're saying, am I correct in understand that you're saying that the peer review tool on Canvas, which I have like not explored because I'm like overwhelmed, but I'm excited to try new things. You're saying that that's like a different kind of process that could like make me a happier person. Can you tell me more about that?
Yeah, I don't know what will make you happy, Sarah, but I think so. I don't know if I can share, but I'm happy to share. But I basically, can I share, Chris? Let me share, if you don't mind. So I hope you guys are seeing my Canvas set of assignments. So here's an example. I have a revised resume. So we go through a whole resume thing as part of this class. This is our junior seminar in biomedical sciences. So if I go, oh, can you now see the revised resume assignment? Yep, here. So that's the assignment, yada, yada. And then over here on the right, I have set it up. I can show you how I edited it. So under the assignment instructions, I basically tell it to require peer reviews. So that then I can tell Canvas to assign the peer reviews, either manually, I can do it at any time, or I can tell Canvas to do it randomly and by, do it at, a minute after this was due. And then I can go in and make sure, and those folks who haven't submitted anything under the revised resume are not going to get a peer review assigned to them. So I have to push them in class that if you want to get credit for the peer review that you're supposed to do, you have to actually submit the original assignment so that others can review you and you get something to review. So that is the feature, Sarah, that I use. And then I have a separate assignment where I give credit and I describe what they're supposed to be doing. So I tell them, okay, in this peer review, you need to do this, and here are the instructions, and here are the prompts that you should be reviewing. The biggest hurdle I find is that, so let me show you if I can, I'm running out of real estate here, what this looks like in the assignment. So in the assignment itself, where you've set it up to do peer reviews, you'll see this little button on the right. And so you can see who's done what. And so I go through, this is where I go through and said, okay, Duran has done it. So I'm going to go to the assignment for the peer review, and I'm going to go through the speed grader and give Duran his credit. The trick that the one hurdle that I find is that students don't often know where to find whom they've been assigned to. And so I took a little screenshot. I went into student view. I took a little screenshot and I said, all right, here's how you find the assignment that you're supposed to be reviewing, or the person whose assignment you're supposed to be reviewing. So that's the nutshell of that. I don't know if that was helpful, but that's what I do. And so I do have groups. All of these paper drafts are written by groups. And then I set the peer reviews to be extra group, not within group, not intra-group.
My only follow-up question is, so do you have to do something to tell Canvas to link those 2 assignments? Like you said on one, it just knows that
no, it doesn't link them. It doesn't link them. So that's the manual part where I go into the original assignment. Okay. I see who's been assigned a peer review and who's done it. So they have a check mark next to their name. And then I open a second window with the actual assignment for credit for the peer review. And then I manually go in and give each student their credit. So I use a 2-window approach.
And that is one of the great problems with the peer review system in Canvas right now. And I think that's why they're looking at the feedback fruits pilot to see if that can solve that, because it really is frustrating to sometimes do it, especially if you have a large and very active class. Yeah. I just want to be mindful of time. I'm happy to stick around as long as anybody wants to, and I'll add some things at the end of the video, even if I'm all by myself. But if you need to leave, it is approaching 1:30 there. So. Did anybody have any further questions? I have a few. Okay. Thanks, Yuta, for attending. That was great. Thanks for sharing. So one question, I guess I had a couple of questions, and one of these is, how large are the classes that you're talking about right now, Rebecca and Ruth? Because I think workload can be a real issue of concern here with this.
Yeah, definitely. So my classes are pretty small. They're like 15 students usually. Ruth's classes might be bigger though.
Yeah, my classes are capped at 30, so it's a lower cap than the 40 that's standard here at UWT. But I've never had 40 of them when I've done them. I think I'm sorry, I've never had 30. I've gotten up there though. I've gotten like 25.
The other question that came up was looking at your example, Rebecca, with the genre area, and you've been using Twitter, which I think is pretty, well, I mean, Twitter's not so great to use now. There are other tools potentially that are Twitter-like maybe that could be used too, but how do you see that idea of genre and the kind of writing translating to other courses and other disciplines? I mean, I kind of see it in Ruth's approach with the technical writing, like there's a particular kind of field there, but what other areas might that include, or what you might think about there?
Yeah, great question. So I think with every assignment, there are expected features that go with that assignment. So research papers, for instance, are a very common assignment that actually vary quite a lot by discipline and have different expectations depending on who's assigning them or what field they're being assigned in. And often those features are invisible to the professors because we're so inside our own disciplines, which makes them kind of opaque to students. And so I think one of the really great benefits of modeling is that you are making those features explicit first to yourself and then to students. And so by looking at examples, you can identify what is expected and then what's effective and what's not effective. So I like, Ruth was using sort of a poor example intentionally so that students could suggest ways that it might be better. And so basically any assignment, any piece of writing is going to have expected features. And so if you can name those for yourself and for students and prioritize them in some way, that is going to make students, it's going to make the process much more transparent, and it will hopefully make them much more successful. In order to be able to meet expectations, you have to know what those expectations are. And I think, especially in writing, we're often not very good at, at articulating that for ourselves. And I speak from personal experience. So,
I mean, it definitely is a common thing in pedagogical design that you want to, make as transparent as possible the learning objectives and goals. And what strikes me about this interesting is not only that shift to the student-centered, but that the things they might, your learning objectives may not be captured within that rubric or within that direct process. You have those larger goals, and sharing those with the students so they understand why they are doing these things and have maybe a little more incentive to participate just seems really valuable to me. One other question I had was the idea of using discussion boards, which I know, Sarah, you said you're using as well, potentially. When you use those, Rebecca, are all students seeing everybody's peer review, or are you using group discussions, and what do you see as potentially, is there a value in that sharing via discussion versus the peer review tool where students only see the students that they're reviewing?
So I think that it could be valuable. So, the way my class is designed, like the priorities are very explicit, they're very transparent. We will all see each other's writing multiple times. So that's like expected. It's for a public audience. So I don't require that students post this online. They could do it. I don't require that. That's not an objective for my class. But the idea is that like anyone could read this. And so like they're writing with that in mind. And so I also think with peer review, like it is valuable to be able to write your feedback in a way that, it could be seen by anyone. It shouldn't be so personal or, biting or negative. I mean, of course you can be constructive, but what I would say there practically is that, students are pretty busy. They're probably not looking at each other's peer review rubrics. But if they did, that would be fine in this context. So you do raise a valuable point that in other contexts that might not be appropriate. So I appreciate that.
Right. That's kind of my questions for today. I will have more, but I'll obviously bring them to you individually. And that reminds me that UWT faculty can come to you and talk about this and have you come to their classes and I assume brainstorm in their discipline what they might be doing. So I'd certainly encourage that.
Yeah, definitely.
Before I close things up, Sarah, did you have any questions?
Of course. Yes, I have two sort of TLC questions, and then Chris, if you're available to hang out for a minute to talk about feedback fruits with like me individually, I would love that, but no pressure. So I've like known about the TLC and I like put it in my, is it right that I call it that? Is that what you all, okay, great. I like put in my syllabus, but I haven't done more with it, but I'm wondering, one, if I'm interested in getting your help in like coming to class to sort of help me with some like modeling, do I just email you, Rebecca? Okay, cool. And then my second question was, do you all have norms and rules around like incorporating visiting the TLC in class assignments? I know there's been, from my previous institution, there was like different kinds of challenges and opportunities with that. So I'm wondering how you've navigated that as a center.
Yeah, great question. So we love it when instructors encourage their students to use the TLC. I am fine with you requiring it. What I would say is it can be frustrating on the student side because they sometimes wait till the last minute and then you have 40 students who are trying to make appointments. There aren't enough appointments. They're really stressed out about losing those 2 points or whatever. So I tend to suggest like extra credit or encouragement. We can do a class visit. You can bring your students in here. That just like practically tends to work a bit better, but like philosophically, I'm not opposed to that. The one other thing is if you are as an instructor grading on whether students come to the TLC, we legally can't tell you if students have visited us. They can tell you, they can provide evidence of that themselves, but privacy laws prevent us from doing so. So that's just like another little wrinkle, but that sounds like kind of negative. We really love to partner with faculty and encourage students and like really encourage them. I don't want to say force, but like really encourage them to come. So I would love to talk to you about like a way that we could make that happen for your students. Ruth has her hand up.
Yeah, so one of the norms that I think Rebecca didn't mention is that the faculty, a lot of faculty hold their social hours or office hours in the TLC, which is a great way of getting them acclimated to the space, introducing them to tutors. Like it's just great at building community. And there's way more space in the TLC than in my office. Like I do not have the capacity for like more than 2 people in my office. And I regularly have way more than that in my office hours, but it's just great to hold office hours there. And so that's a great way of really getting them used to it. And it doesn't have to be extra credit even. They just like, they're turning in their assignments because I'm there. Good.
Thank you.
Anything else? Oh, sorry. Anything else, Sarah? No, not for now. Okay. Well, I just wanted to add a couple things. As I mentioned earlier, anywhere you should be seeing this video in the future, you should also see links to resources, curriculum, everything shared by Rebecca and Ruth. Also, this is a Passport eligible session. So there is a Passport page, the Passport to Teaching Excellence program from the Office of Digital Learning, where you can perform some activities of reflection and devising a peer review activity to get a stamp on your passport, which makes you excellenter, I think. So if you're watching this from the flying cars in the future, you can probably still do that. And I just wanted to also just thank you, Ruth and Rebecca, for, I mean, I learned a lot. This is excellent. And I'm really grateful that you gave us your time. And I assume you will probably see some follow-up from everyone who is here, or at least many of us, about this. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
Bye.